The Babylon Project was our last best hope for sci-fi, a self-contained podcast 1 hour long located on the internet, a place of fun and discussion for Babylon 5 fans everywhere, a shining beacon in cyberspace, all alone in the night. It was the dawn of the 20th anniversary of Babylon 5, the year the Great War to free Bab 5 came upon us all. This is the story of the last of the Babylon podcast. The year is 2016. The name of the place is the Babylon Project Podcast.
This is Maggie Egan, your ISN news anchor, and you're listening to the Babylon Project podcast.
Hello there, Babylon 5 fans. This is Raul and Jim bringing you the next episode of the Babylon Project podcast. How are you tonight, my friend?
I'm good. Looking forward to talking about Confessions and Lamentations.
Confessions and Lamentations. Is that a discussion about the day I had today? Or is this the show where the episode we're going to be reviewing?
Yeah, we're second season number 18, Confessions and Lamentations.
Okay. I'll do my best to keep my brain focused because today was, what's the word I'm looking for?
Nutso.
Clinical and regulatory and scientific hell.
Nutso.
Yeah, in some ways, I can sure relate to Dr. Lazarin today. It was one of those days for me.
Yeah.
Oh,
Poor Dr. Lazarin.
poor Dr. Lazarin. But that would probably make more sense if people knew what we were talking about.
It would.
So, would you mind giving us a recap of this episode?
Coming right up.
Archive. Access. Initiated.
Many members of the Markab race on Babylon 5 and on the Markab homeworld begin mysteriously dying. Dr. Franklin and his friend and colleague Dr. Lazarin, a Markab doctor, begin desperately searching for a cure. It is later determined that all members of the Markab race aboard the station should be quarantined because it is not known if their fatal disease is able to cross to other species. Delenn and Lennier announce their intention to go into quarantine with the Markab to offer comfort and hope. Sheridan is completely against this, as he and Delenn have been developing a closer relationship. But when Sheridan realizes that she is determined, he reluctantly gives in. When Dr. Franklin finds a member of the Pakmara has also been inflicted with the Markab disease, Dr. Lazarin sacrifices himself by doing an autopsy, thus allowing Franklin to find a cure for the disease. However, when Franklin arrives at the place where the Markab have been quarantined, all have succumbed to the disease and only Delenn and Lennier have survived. Sheridan offers comfort and support to a very upset Delenn. Well, there it is.
Character. Files. Open.
All right, thank you, Jim. We didn't have a whole lot of guest stars on this episode this time, did we?
No, there wasn't. Jim Norton did make an appearance once again. He was Ombuds Wellington in earlier episodes. He's in with us today as Dr. Lazarin.
Right.
And of course, we cannot ever forget Maggie Egan as our favorite ISN reporter.
Right. One other person that I think is worth mentioning is the little Markab girl.
Yes. Blue Jean Ashley Seacrest. Yeah, she did a really, really good job.
Mm-hmm.
However, she didn't really appear in much after that.
No.
Her last career credit is in the year 2000. So apparently she was active from 1995 to 2000.
Uh-huh. And pretty much disappeared from acting after that. So I suppose we could presume she got a real job.
Or decided to get her degree.
Yep.
But there it is.
Initiating plot analysis.
Well, as we've already kind of indicated, this is a Marcab-heavy episode.
Yeah, and other than a few spots, there's not a lot of humor in this episode at all.
No, just some stuff at the beginning. The episode starts out with a Marcab transport being behind schedule and Sheridan wanting to send out a squad to look for them. And that's where we find that Lieutenant Keffer has been out, shall we say, doing some off-schedule searching on his own for this unknown ship that he saw.
Yeah, he's freelancing on his own time.
Right, and Sheridan wants that stopped.
Well, of course, he's going out by himself, especially if there's something that is unknown what it is, that wouldn't be a real smart thing to do.
Right, well, and Sheridan somewhat having an idea of what it is at this point.
Yeah.
Recognizes the danger of Keffer actually finding something.
Yeah, he tells Ivanova, we're going to shut this little adventure down right away.
Right. And in the meantime, Dr. Franklin is verifying a, air quotes for those who don't have cameras, natural death. And in the course of doing this, he's bantering with someone who's obviously a friend of his, a Marcab named Dr. Lazarin, which is, okay, the name is definitely ironic, I would say.
Yeah.
In this case. So almost biblical proportion, huh?
Yeah, I would say that. But, well, we'll find out later that he isn't his namesake.
Yeah, quite in fact, the whole, that's the irony of it. The whole story there is the opposite. But
yeah. I love the back and forth between Franklin and Lazarin.
Right.
It was a lot of fun.
You can tell it's a friendship, and it seems to be one that goes way back, and we'll find out a little bit more about that later on. But Franklin's going to insist on an autopsy.
Well, yeah, there have been 4 deaths supposedly by natural causes, which is not natural.
No, well, depending on the population size, but for this population size, no, not at all. In the meantime, we have Susan sending out the team for the missing transport. And Susan's conversation with Keffer. Antonio, I know you listen, so this one's for you. This is his favorite, one of his favorite pieces out of the show.
Lieutenant? Just one more thing. The captain wants a moratorium on your little expeditions into hyperspace.
Come on, Commander, it's on my own time.
That's not the issue. Things are getting a little nuts around here right now. You should know that better than anyone else.
But there's something out there.
Yes, there is. There's something out there. There's also something in here. The something in here is me giving you a direct order.
Commander,
If there's some part of that sentence that you don't understand, Lieutenant, I'd be happy to explain it to you over the next 4 months. We'll be watching Zeta Squadron go on missions without you.
Understood. We'll be back in a few hours.
So yeah, he's been shut down pretty thoroughly, and when he tries to argue, he gets rank pulled on him.
I would much rather face a fleet of shadow vessels than a cranky Susan Ivanova.
Well, she wasn't cranky until he started coming back.
Yep. Now, we also find Sheridan at dinner with Delenn. This is just sort of a repayment of their previous dinner date. The first dinner, we had human style. This dinner, Minbari style.
Oh, yeah.
Which means lots of prayers, lots of ritual, and no LBD. For those who don't remember LBD, little black dress.
Oh, yeah. She definitely was traditionally Minbari in this one.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say lots of prayer, lots of ritual, and not a lot of eating.
Yeah. Meditating upon food. You could starve at a Minbari meal. Let's face it.
Uh-huh.
I've got to say something though. If you haven't, rewatch that scene and watch Mira Furlan closely. I'd love to see the outtakes of it because she is so obviously trying not to laugh.
Well, and, Boxleitner is playing it perfectly. He is awesome.
Yeah, it is, a Cranky Susan is one of Antonio's favorite scenes. This is one of my favorite comic scenes in the series, actually.
Yeah, it's just all too short.
Yep.
You know what? I don't think the Minbari ever have any hot food if they eat like this every day.
Oh, good heavens, no. No. But this is also where Sheridan gets introduced to Flarn.
Ah.
He will find out much later on he takes a real liking to it. But Kefir, he's out on his patrol, and he finds that Markab's ship all dead.
Yeah, the entire complement of the ship is dead.
Yeah, how many was that? A couple hundred?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number.
Franklin is working on his autopsy and getting suspicious, and Kefir tows the ship back.
Yeah, there were 200 dead on the transport.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And the deaths on the station. It's not looking good for the Markab at all.
No.
And then, of course, Franklin would definitely become even more suspicious when you think about when he sees all of this going on. There's something definitely not right.
Yeah, and he's going to get Lazarin called to task on it.
Mm-hmm.
On the lighter side, and actually I think this is the final light moment of the entire episode, Sheridan snores.
No, he doesn't. Just ask him.
Yeah. Well, he's called away because of all of this stuff going on with the Markab. But fortunately, the ritual is over, so Lennier can finally sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of the things we didn't mention is that Lennier had been awake 2 days fixing that meal.
Yeah.
On bread and water.
Uh-huh. And Lennier says as Sheridan departs, we must do this again, but he didn't look or sound very convincing.
No, not in the least. And what did they say to each other in Minbari?
I listened to that a couple of times, and about the only thing I could pick out of that was the word Flarn.
Uh-huh. Now, I know there isn't, Straczynski actually never did provide a translation of that, just so you know. But for some reason, it reminds me of The Wrath of Khan.
Okay.
Leonard Nimoy, Kirstie Alley, Elevator.
Oh, okay.
He's so human. You know the scene I'm talking about, right?
I do.
Oh, yeah.
I do indeed.
There's something about that interchange that just puts me in mind almost as if it were a tip of the hat to Wrath of Khan there.
Well, it could be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It looked to me like Lennier was making a negative observation about something that Sheridan either was doing or had done.
Yeah, and Delenn's response was seemingly along the lines of, he's only human.
Yeah.
Well, Sheridan gets to the ship that's been towed in to find Lazarin trying to keep all the B5 people out. That doesn't fly because Franklin shows up with his discovery of the plague.
Yeah, which is really scary when you get like a space station or something with a plague.
Yeah.
There's nowhere to go to get away from it.
No. And by the time you can get out here, you've got a good chance of already being infected.
Yeah, and at this point, we don't know if this plague would jump species or not.
Nope. No, we don't. Which hits one of my pet peeves of this episode.
Okay.
You're talking about viral infections here?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Surgical masks do not keep viruses out. End of discussion.
No,
And you're not going to go in to that kind of a contaminated area in a lab coat.
unless you're a television show with a limited budget.
It's category 4 procedures here. Which incidentally is my chance to pitch another book for you to read if you haven't. Hot Zone.
Hot zone?
Hot Zone, yeah. True story. It's about the Ebola outbreak in Reston, Virginia that happened in, I think, the early 90s.
Oh.
Yeah, we had an Ebola outbreak in the U.S. It will scare the bejeebers out of you. And it's a nonfiction work.
Okay.
But anyway, it seems that the Marcab are keeping this disease quiet because there is a social stigma attached to it,
Mm-hmm.
that it only affects the immoral. So,
Yeah.
as a result, the plague has spread across their entire home planet and all their colonies, and they don't know if it can or can't cross species.
Yeah. And they mentioned that it was due to certain excesses, immorality, and to
Yeah.
me it just sounds like it's ignorance by choice.
Yeah, ignorance by choice. Unfortunately, this is what happens every frickin' time you mix science and politics. And sorry, I am speaking as a scientist here. This is a subject where I have to fight to keep a lid on my language so it doesn't turn into an explicit setting on iTunes.
Oh yeah. Well, we could fill another hour talking about the philosophy behind this and throwing in religion on top of that, which there's many different beliefs and things.
Now, if you go through to the Lurker's Guide and you review Straczynski's notes, his commentary, he's primarily focusing on the science and politics, but there is a religious contrast here between the Marcab and the Minbari.
Uh-huh.
That there is really a certain beauty to it. Like I said, pet peeve, and I think we'll probably end up getting back to this a little later.
It'll probably come up a couple of times.
Keep science and politics separate. The moment, anyway, let's go to the girl finding her dad. That's actually a happier discussion for me than this one.
Oh yeah, but I'll tell you what, for me, this is the most gruesome scene of, well,
it's hard to watch, especially if you're a dad.
This is the number one most gruesome scene of the whole show.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the whole series.
Yeah, definitely. It's just hard to watch.
Little girl, she comes out, she's looking for her daddy, and finds him with Delenn's help, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And he's just sitting there, doesn't move until she touches him, and then he kind of falls to the side, and he has succumbed to the plague.
Yep. And when Antonio watches that, he's 12 years old, 5'8", 180 pounds of muscle, and he still just wraps around me.
Yeah.
But
yeah, well, it's one of those moments that make you want to go hug your kid.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is exactly what I do now that I have one to make that connection. We do learn about the disease at least a little bit. Actually, we learn what we don't know, how much we don't know about this disease.
Uh-huh. Well, before we move on, I wanted to mention that the entire scene was wrapped up by Delenn and the look on her face.
Oh.
You did not have to see anything else. They could have just skipped showing the scene and you could have figured out what was going on.
Yep. Mira Furlan has a lot of non-vocal, very serious acting roles in this episode that really, really highlight her skills.
Oh, yeah.
And this is just the first.
All right, you were beginning to talk about some of the things we learned about the infection.
Or don't know. All we do know really about is once the infection goes active, once it's past this incubation time, which can be potentially weeks, there's a 24-hour kill time. And once it's out of dormancy, it's highly contagious, and it is 100% fatal. Different species, so it can't necessarily speak to that, but I'm not going to put my epidemiologic hat on just yet.
Okay.
Now, they don't even know how it transmits, whether it's airborne or contact. They really, because its kill factor is so fast and people are so hidden, quiet about it, they haven't even been able to model the progression of the disease. So the scientific community doesn't see it until it's at either its end stages or they're already dead.
Well, there's such a stigma about it. It hasn't been dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, it's kind of like the lepers of decades or millennia past. You just put them all somewhere by themselves, and you leave them alone, and they leave you alone.
Yeah. Or the AIDS, the way AIDS was dealt with in the 90s, right around the time this episode came out, in fact.
Yeah. A lot of stigma surrounding that, too.
Mm-hmm. But Sheridan declares a quarantine. Garibaldi gets ready for riots.
Uh-huh. And, what Mike brings up is a pretty good point, actually. Yeah. Isolation doesn't work. It only inflames the situation, is what Mike says. And
yes.
I grabbed that.
What about segregating the Markabs from the rest of the general population?
No. If the disease is airborne, then moving them into a different part of the station is not going to solve the problem. All the air is recycled. If it turns out that the disease is not transmissible to other species, then confining them to one area will only speed up the infection among the Markab community without good reason.
On the other hand, when word gets out that we've got the next best thing to the Black Death roaming the station, it's going to scare everybody. And when people get scared, they start looking for scapegoats. If we can keep the Markabs all together in one place, my people can protect them. Because trust me, this is going to get real ugly real fast.
Talk about a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Who do you go with? Franklin is saying if you're all you're going to do is concentrate this and make more Markab sick. And on Mike's side, he said, if you don't get these people out of the population, there is going to be big trouble.
With the air recirculating, and as big as the station is, you could do quarters isolation in case it's not an airborne transmission, or you can do segregated, group quarantines, not necessarily in the same location, but beyond that, frankly.
Yeah, well, without knowing what you're dealing with, it's almost impossible to make the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're going to be second guessing yourself all the time.
But considering the nature of the space station, there really isn't much point in additional quarantining, other than keeping the station itself isolated and quarantining anyone who's left the station since they've known about since the plague could have first shown up.
Yeah.
Or actually, since it can be dormant for a few weeks, go back to the first death, and then as your time 0, and then go 0 minus 2 weeks. I mean, that's what you would have to try to do as far as quarantining it. And of course, it doesn't take long for us to see the unrest of the quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
I will say this, at least they've moved up to a plastic gate from the little orangey.
Oh, the snow fence, yeah.
Yeah, from BAB 4.
Yeah.
So, where are we now?
Well, so everything seems to be going to hell in a handbasket.
Yep. The Markab ambassador is rather honked off.
Yeah. Well, and he's not a scientist, so he probably buys into this unclean
Yep.
thing.
He takes, and you saw one of my pet peeves, he goes straight into my other pet peeve where sciences are concerned, because he takes a political, religious approach to science, and declares he always solves the "what do we do" question that Sheridan and Garibaldi and Franklin were debating, because they decide that they will isolate themselves. But, oh God, I'll keep this simple. As far as religion and science are concerned, how do I put it? Ah! Okay. Again, not only am I speaking as a scientist, I am also speaking as an active Christian apologist. It's not a matter of of the two being compatible. It's a matter of how you apply one to the other.
Yeah, that ambassador clearly believes, or I don't know whether he believes it or not, but he states very clearly immorality is the cause of this.
Yeah. Now, I know you're on the agnostic side. I'm on the Christian theist side. And while I don't reject the idea necessarily of acts of God and punishment, this is not what and how the Bible teaches it. End of discussion.
Okay, drop the mic. At any rate.
All right, Raul rant over. Sorry, guys.
Franklin finds out it is an airborne disease.
And he finds out because they've found a dead Pakmara who has died from this disease.
So it is not only airborne, but it will jump species, certain species.
Yes, this is what in the scientific and medical community we call a bad thing.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And capital T.
Yeah.
Right.
And then Franklin goes on to mention that given time, this disease would actually mutate and be able to infect all the species on the station eventually.
Well, here I would disagree with stating that as a fact. It is a possibility, not necessarily a certainty. But again, this is getting into epidemiology here.
Well, it's a television show.
Correct.
And what would be more scary than 250,000 dead people from a plague?
Yeah. And the truth is, he doesn't know. Can it? Will it? Won't it? Who knows? Is it going to potentially infect you? I mean, I had mentioned the Ebola. I had mentioned Hot Zone and the Ebola outbreak in Reston. This was actually, this is a very good example of this, in fact, because it was a military research facility. They were doing research on monkeys. They weren't trying to weaponize Ebola, but the fear was that other countries would. So they were working on trying to get a defense of it. And Ebola Zaire is the one that has been in the news in the past few years in Africa that has been killing humans. Well, they were doing the research on a different strain of Ebola that infected monkeys. And it wiped out the entire monkey population. Well, what they discovered was, this thing must have ended up being airborne, and it jumped species, and guess what? It did infect the humans. It just didn't have the appropriate receptor proteins to turn the virus on. But it was certainly in the scientists that were exposed to it. So that's the part that makes it so scary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, imagine finding out that you're toting the virus for this plague around in your cells. And basically it's in every cell of your body. For me, that at least was the real scare of the thing. But they go ahead and they self-quarantine. Franklin is working furiously to try and find if not a cure, at least a vaccine. And his staff doesn't want to work on the Pakmara.
None of them were going to do anything. Franklin finally said, okay, I will go in and do it.
Yep. And actually, Lazarin shows up here at this point, and he says that he'll do the job. And he's saying that knowing it's almost certainly a death sentence.
Yeah. Well, Lazarin shows a lot of courage here. And if you're going to die, he's going to die fighting.
Yep.
Trying to find the truth. Thank goodness we have at least one scientist among the Marcab.
Yeah. Now, here's the other spot where I took issue. I said there was a couple of spots where I took issue with the plotting. And this was the second. I was doing the clinical side research during the 80s, in particular the late 80s. In other words, right at the time when AIDS was really starting to pick up.
Uh-huh.
That response from Franklin's staff is probably, if not 100%, it is at least 99-98% unrealistic. That's not the reality of it. Bear in mind, I was doing clinical cardiac research. I was doing Holter monitoring. I was also one of the ones that was hooking up the patients to the equipment. And yes, I worked on AIDS patients. Sometimes, remember, this was in the 80s before a lot of the aseptic techniques took out, sometimes without gloves.
Mm-hmm.
There are very, very few in the medical community who would bat an eye at it, at least back in that time.
Well,
but it's, as you've been saying, it's TV, it's drama.
It is. And realistically, from what I understand, the facts are about AIDS is in order to get the virus, you have to get a lot of the virus.
That's true with most viruses, actually.
Into the body in order for it to do anything.
But remember, in the late 80s, the mid and late 80s, we didn't know much about the transmission of AIDS.
Yeah. It didn't happen by handshakes. It didn't happen by sitting on toilet seats and,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. It wasn't casual contact that spread it.
Right. But it's just, so I guess I'm just being a little defensive about some aspects of what is partially, at least, one of my professions. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
look at the Ebola. Look at the Ebola outbreaks. The docs that just took the risk going to Africa to treat those patients because someone had to, and it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, those are the heroes.
That's the bulk of the medical community, though.
Oh, I have no doubt about that.
Anyway,
this was this display in Babylon 5 of everybody backing away and saying no way was really unrealistic in my mind.
But, like you said, it is TV, and it does build the drama.
It reinforces the point that we have more of a stigma going on here than a actual situation.
Mm-hmm. And it also contrasts well with what we see as far as the violence rising against the Marcab, because that's part of Garibaldi's reporting. That's 4,000 of the 5,000 Marcab on the station are going into their self-imposed isolation, and apparently another 1,000 are in hiding somewhere. Can't help but wonder if the 4,000 in isolation might not have given the other 1,000 a bit of a chance.
Well, who's to say?
Yep, who's to say? We finally hit what I think is probably one of the high points of the episode. Delenn and Lennier, they want to go in and minister them to the Marcab in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, this is why I was talking about the contrast. In the same way that the macabre had a religious perspective motive behind it, so is hers. Remember, she's from the priestly caste,
Mm-hmm.
and I love the way you I love the way you describe her in her notes there.
Ah,
Um,
yeah. Delenn is doing the right thing for the right reason
mm-hmm.
to provide aid and comfort.
At the right time, too.
Yes.
I know if I was in that situation, I would be desperate for someone like that.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Sheridan does not want to let her in.
Oh, no.
His personal feelings are getting into the way here. And another beautiful moment. There were a lot of John and Delenn shippers, of course, in Babylon 5. And this was their big episode in that dynamic of the relationship, because they pretty much confessed their feelings without saying it.
Yeah.
Do you have that clip? We've got to play
I do.
that. Go for it.
But if it's not, then we must give comfort, because very soon we will require it ourselves.
You will be exposing yourself to massive contamination. If I let you into that isolation zone, I can't let you out again.
I know.
All right. I'll tell security to let you through.
Thank you. Don't look away, Captain. All life is transitory. A dream. We all come together in the same place at the end of time. If I don't see you again here, I will see you in a little while. In the place where no shadows fall.
Delenn? When I do see you again, call me John.
Yes, that was the big switch. And it's not just Delenn with that kind of intense compassion. We see it with Garibaldi as the violence is spreading, and he gives aid to that macabre that's been attacked.
Well, he like everyone else will do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
At least all of our stars.
Most of our stars, at least the stars that we see in this episode, because we're not seeing Jakar, we're not seeing Londo.
Yeah, very true.
And one thing, in some regards, well, let's put it this way. I'm wondering how Delenn will be able to handle the situation, because I don't know that she's ever had to face the reality of those beliefs and convictions before. Now, I know we've seen her with her role in the Earth Minbari War, but that's a little bit of a different thing. There's a difference between that and attack and the kind of potential self-sacrifice. And it's not even the physical self-sacrifice, it's the emotional self-sacrifice that kind of ministry sucks out of you. And I don't think she's been to that place before in her. So it's
no, I don't. I have to agree with you.
It's a difficult place to get into, and it becomes an even more difficult place to come out of again once you're there. So it's going to be. We'll see how she handles it.
Yeah. Well, now we see Franklin.
Yep.
And as one would expect most any doctor to do, he's running on stimulants.
Again.
Yeah.
A little bit more foreshadowing that I guess traces itself all the way back. You had mentioned Quality of Mercy at the beginning of our episode. I think that's where we got the first hints of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's discussing the Black Death and the great irony of cats.
Yeah. And we're not talking about the cats that Londo was worrying about getting nibbled.
Yeah, not the cats that are nibbling to death.
These are the real cats.
Do you have that for us?
I do.
Lessons we've learned.
What was this, Black Death?
Well, it hit Earth around the middle of the 14th century. Before it was finished, it wiped out 3/4 of the European population. They said the same things, too. It was punishment from God for our immorality. Some blamed the Jews and the lepers for poisoning the wells, and others said the plague was sent by the devil. And since cats were supposed to be the devil's familiars, they were killed by the millions. But cats were the only means of controlling the real source of the plague, the rats and the fleas that went with them. So all they were doing was helping the plague spread even faster.
That does seem to be the rule, doesn't it? Analyze the problem, choose whichever strategy makes least sense, and then do it.
And as that ends, Lazarus stumbles and he's showing Frank presentation of the virus. So Franklin can study him now. He can monitor the progression. But they are, at this point, truly racing the clock.
Mm-hmm.
Delenn and Lennier, they are in and they're helping as best they can. And they find that child again, who has lost her mother this time.
Yeah, looking for Mom.
Delenn tasks Lennier with finding the child's mom with the words, "Faith manages."
Yeah.
Franklin's team is on overdrive, and this is where we find out that he goes way back with Lazarus. And, this is sort of the no-win situation, sort of to make another Star Trek reference, the Babylon 5 equivalent of the Kobayashi Maru. But,
yeah.
And we get some quick cuts back and forth. They do find the child's mom, and while Lennier is looking, I love Delenn's lost story. But
yeah, she gives some comfort to the child with that.
But I will say, I broke into tears, literally, with the look of horror on Delenn's face when the little girl stumbles and she realizes what's happened.
Yeah. That it's finally gotten that far.
Uh-huh.
And you know what? At that point, all the hope for the Marcab goes out of a possibility in my mind.
It truly does.
You know they're doomed because this one little girl could not survive.
Right. And Lazarus dies just as the cure is found.
Yeah.
And the rush is on to synthesize it, at least enough to start administering it to the Marcab.
Yeah.
But from the quarantine site, there is nothing but silence.
Yeah, it's kind of sad.
Mm-hmm.
You knew what was going to happen.
Yeah, except for the Minbari, all dead. Lennier is crushed, but Delenn, she's beyond devastated.
Mm-hmm.
She is really beyond devastated. Her earlier comment about faith managing, and again, this is taken from the Christian perspective, which is my worldview. Her response there, this is where we see the manifestation of her statement of faith managing, because she is, it's the devastation, and that's all she has left to cling to as she collapses into John's arms. Oh, and now we get to the wrap up.
Yep, we have Maggie coming on to give us a report.
Yeah, the Marcab civilization, for all practical purposes, is wiped out. The question, are there enough pockets of survivors to eventually rebuild the race? Probably. Someday, eventually. But that said, the civilization itself, yeah, it's gone.
Yeah, pretty much.
And the final ending, the bad jokes.
Yeah, I know.
You know, it happened with AIDS. We saw it in recent years with the Ebola outbreak. I think I'm a little more thick-skinned immune where my disgust is concerned than most people. It's disgusting, but it's sort of a coping mechanism, it seems, for the really, really weak. But
I don't know. See, now my point of view is how did Franklin not just get up and beat the snot out of this guy? You know?
Probably because he's taking much that same look.
Well, he sounded more like the guy making the joke, he sounded more like a bigot.
Oh, I'm not gonna I won't argue with that. I won't hesitate to agree with you there. And Franklin's final line, nothing changes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he is all too right.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, I think this was not necessarily an arc episode. There were some elements
critical to the arc
that will become, very critical to the arc, but it doesn't really fit in the overall episode, the theme of it.
Yeah.
Which seemed to carry more of a social message than being part of the storyline.
True, but the social message that it was speaking to was certainly a fit with the series and with the show.
Yeah. Some of the things that I think fit into the arc were Sheridan and Delenn's relationship changing.
Oh, absolutely.
Franklin and Stimms will be coming up later. Delenn and her compassion. And I refer to the Inquisitor, the upcoming Inquisitor episode.
Yeah, he challenges her on that, where the compassion is concerned. And it's kind of in the same context that I was questioning, you know, does she really see, or has she really faced the reality of that compassion before?
Yeah. And Lazarin's sacrifice, he definitely sacrificed himself, a theme for the rest of the series.
That's, in a lot of ways, that's what Babylon 5, and this, Jim, I think this is why, even though the subject matter doesn't necessarily fit, it fits with the show itself, because sacrifice and consequences of choice is what this show is about. So yeah, that's a very good point on your part.
So do you think Sheridan made a mistake shutting Keffer's investigations down?
Oh, no. He certainly did the right thing. If nothing else, he delayed the inevitable. I don't know that I would have... Let's just say I'm not necessarily surprised that Keffer didn't really pay too much attention ultimately. I mean, he at the end of it all, and we're spoiler friendly here, at the end of it all, he disobeys orders. Yeah, what was that we just said about consequences for actions?
Yeah, he pays big ones.
Yeah, though that was also partly Straczynski's response. Remember at the beginning of the season when Keffer first showed up, I had mentioned that that character was the one time that the suits in management interfered with the show and wanted a certain type of character in.
Yeah. But you know something? So, at the beginning, Keffer did not come across as an insubordinate officer.
No.
But he, that little tiff he got into with Susan definitely painted a different picture of him. I was more surprised about him being insubordinate like that.
Mm-hmm. Hey, JP, your thoughts on that? Would a mere lieutenant get snarky with a commander like that in the real world? Inquiring minds want to know.
Well, and my take on that is, as two people work together and become more familiar, perhaps there's a tendency to, drop the rank kind of thing and think you're friends, and that's when they need to be snapped back exactly the way that Susan did.
Uh-huh.
You know, I'm a commander, you're a lieutenant, and I've given you an order. Now you will follow it.
Yeah, just because we drink together at the bar doesn't, don't make that mistake.
Right.
Oh. So did we make it through a tough episode?
Yeah, it's this is definitely a tough one.
It is one of the more powerful. It is certainly one of the more emotionally powerful episodes.
I think this one actually achieved what some of the past episodes where they attempted to tug at the heartstrings failed.
Well, actually, the very first, that was the Marcab in Believers, correct?
I don't think so.
No, it was not. No, it was not. I just actually pulled up the image, and it's very similar in how they present themselves and their attitudes, but very, very different in appearance. But yeah, this episode, if you remember back in season 1, I was not impressed really that much with Believers.
Right.
This episode powerfully succeeds, where Believers failed.
Uh-huh.
At least that's how it came to me. Oh, well, sir, any final thoughts?
No, I think we pretty well covered that. What's coming next?
What is coming next?
Yes.
Divided loyalties. In this episode, we get someone back.
Yes.
We sort of lose someone in the process, and there is a really, really huge twist thrown into the entire story.
Yep. We're not going to spoil it, though. Not yet, anyway.
Even though most of you have probably seen this, we're still going to hold off until.
Keep it under wraps.
You got it.
Well, should we say goodnight?
I think that would be a very good idea, sir. Particularly since there was no boom today.
No, none at all.
What about tomorrow?
Perhaps. Thinking about the next episode coming up, there'll be some boom for sure.
Yeah, well, there's always a boom tomorrow.
Yes.
Right. Good night, everybody.
So long.
Podcast terminated. Thank you for listening to the Babylon Project podcast. You can email Raul and Jim at the Babylon Project podcast @gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at the Babylon Project Podcast. On the internet, we are at babylonprojectpodcast.wordpress.com. To subscribe to the podcast, you can find us on iTunes, or you can subscribe to the RSS feed on the webpage.